The year 1094 was not carved in stone, it was forged in blood. Outside the towering walls of Valencia, the air was a thick, stagnant soup of salt from the Mediterranean and the iron tang of a 20-month siege. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, known to the world as El Cid, sat motionless upon Babieca. The great white stallion sensed the tension in its master's thighs, its ears twitching at the rhythmic thud of drums echoing from the south. Those were not the drums of the Spanish kingdoms. They were the deep, bone-shaking skins of the Almoravid Empire, a fundamentalist whirlwind from the deserts of Africa that had already swallowed half the peninsula. Rodrigo knew the math of war better than any man alive. If he did not break Valencia today, the Almoravids would pin his exhausted army against these very walls and grind them into the dust of history. There was no room for mercy, no time for tactical elegance. It was either the crown of a king or the shroud of a traitor. The city of Valencia sat like a limestone jewel, defiant and starving. Behind its battlements, the defenders were eating leather and boiled grass, yet they held on, spurred by the hope of the black banners rising on the horizon. Rodrigo looked at his men. They were a ragged collection of Castilian exiles, mercenary knights and local levies who followed him, not for a king, but for the sheer magnetic force of his will. He raised his hand, and the heavy silence of the morning was shattered. He didn't order a slow advance. He ordered a sprint into the mouth of hell. "For the cross and for Valencia!" his voice roared, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The charge was a chaotic symphony of violence. 4,000 hooves hammered the dry earth, sending up a cloud of grit that partially obscured the first wave from the archers on the towers. As they closed within 150 meters, the sky turned black. Thousands of arrows, launched from heavy Moorish composite bows, whistled through the air in a lethal arc. The sound was like a swarm of angry hornets. Rodrigo felt the wind of a shaft passing inches from his throat, but he did not flinch. To his right, a veteran knight was struck squarely in the chest. The arrow punched through the steel links of his hauberk as if they were wet parchment, throwing him backward off his horse. The line did not break. It couldn't. Under Rodrigo's command, retreat was a word that had been erased from the lexicon. At the Cuarte Gate, the strongest point of the city's defenses, the air became a furnace. The defenders began to pour boiling oil and pitch from the machicolations. The screaming of horses and men joined the cacophony of the crashing surf nearby. Rodrigo leaped from his saddle before Babieca could be hit, hitting the ground with a heavy metallic thud. He grabbed a massive rectangular shield from a fallen infantryman and pushed toward the front. The sappers were already there, struggling with the ram, a gargantuan trunk of scorched oak tipped with a jagged iron head. Every second they spent under the gatehouse cost a dozen lives. Huge blocks of masonry were dropped from above, crushing shields and the men beneath them like insects. "Push!" Rodrigo bellowed, his shoulder pressed against the freezing wood of the ram alongside his men. "Again!" The first strike against the iron-studded oak of the gate was a dull, vibrating boom that felt like it would shatter the bones in their chests. The gate groaned, but it held. From the murder holes above, long spears jabbed down, seeking the gaps in their armor. Rodrigo pulled his sword, Tizona. The blade, legendary for its sharpness and balance, hummed as it cut through the air, shearing off the heads of the spears that threatened his sappers. He was a whirlwind of steel and grit, his face masked in a mixture of soot, blood, and sweat. The second strike of the ram cracked the primary crossbeam. A collective shout rose from the Christian ranks, but the defenders responded with a desperate fury, throwing jars of Greek fire that turned the ground into a lake of unquenchable flames. Men became living torches, staggering away into the dust. Rodrigo ignored the heat that threatened to blister the skin beneath his mail. He saw the weakness. The center hinge was bucking. "One more!" he screamed, his voice rasping. With a final agonizing heave, the iron-reinforced hinges snapped with a sound like a ship's mast breaking in a storm. The Cuarte Gate didn't just open. It collapsed inward, crushing several defenders who had been bracing it with their bodies. The tunnel of the gatehouse was a dark, narrow slaughterhouse. In the shadows, the elite Moorish guards waited, their scimitars gleaming. Rodrigo was the first man through the dust. He met the first guard in a collision of steel that sent sparks flying into the gloom. Tizona was a blur, a silver streak that found the gaps in leather and bone with surgical precision. This wasn't the chivalrous combat of the tournament. This was the frantic, claustrophobic butchery of urban conquest. They fought over the bodies of the fallen, slipping on blood-slicked stones. Step by step, Rodrigo pushed them back into the light of the main plaza. As his knights poured through the breach, the city of Valencia finally began to scream. The internal walls were high, and every rooftop was a vantage point for a sniper. Rodrigo didn't stop to celebrate. He knew the citadel, the Alcaiceria, must be taken before the sun reached its zenith. He led a detachment through the winding, narrow alleys of the market district. It was a labyrinth of shadows where death could come from any doorway. An old woman threw a heavy bronze pot from a balcony, nearly cracking a sergeant's helm. A group of hidden archers opened fire from a hidden courtyard. Rodrigo took a shallow cut across his thigh from a hidden blade, but he didn't slow down. He kicked in doors, cleared staircases, and kept his eyes on the high towers. By the time they reached the inner courtyard of the citadel, the resistance was crumbling. The local governor, realizing the Almoravids wouldn't arrive in time to save his neck, attempted to flee through a postern gate, but Rodrigo's cavalry intercepted him. The banners of the Cid, the green cross, were hoisted over the highest minaret, replacing the silken flags of the Taifa. For a brief, flickering moment, the air was filled with the cheers of exhausted, blood-stained men. They had done the impossible. They had taken the impregnable city. Rodrigo climbed the highest rampart of the seaward wall to catch his breath. His lungs burned, and his hands were cramped into the shape of his sword hilt. He looked out over the Mediterranean, expecting to see the beauty of the morning. Instead, his heart turned to lead. The horizon was no longer blue, it was black. A vast, shimmering mass of thousands upon thousands of Almoravid warriors was spilling over the southern ridges like a slow-moving lava flow. They were not miles away. They were at the doorstep. The dust cloud they raised was so immense it began to blot out the sun. Rodrigo looked down at his shattered gate and his tired, wounded men. He had just fought the greatest battle of his life to get into this city, only to realize he had just locked himself inside a coffin. The first of the Almoravid drums began to beat again, much louder now, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of a monster. Rodrigo gripped the stone merlin until his gauntlet creaked. He had the city, but he had no food, no reinforcements, and an empire was currently encircling his new kingdom. The heavy iron bars of the gate he had just broken were useless now. The celebration of the fall of Valencia lasted exactly 7 minutes. That was the time it took for the last of El Cid's scouts to gallop through the shattered remains of the Cuate gate, screaming that the Almoravid vanguard was less than a league away. Rodrigo didn't waste a second on triumph. While his men were still wiping the blood of the city's defenders from their blades, he was already barking orders that turned the liberated city into a pressurized furnace. The transition from conqueror to the besieged was instantaneous. He ordered the gates to be walled up with the very rubble they had created during the assault. Every man, from the highest-born knight to the lowest camp follower, was pressed into service. They hauled massive limestone blocks and furniture from abandoned villas, creating a makeshift barrier of stone and desperation. The Almoravid army didn't just arrive, they flooded the horizon. From the high towers of the citadel, Rodrigo watched as the golden plains of the Huerta were swallowed by a sea of black tents and flickering campfires. There were tens of thousands of them, warriors from the Sahara, fanatical and disciplined, led by commanders who viewed the Cid not just as an enemy, but as a blasphemy that needed to be erased. The sound of their arrival was a psychological weapon in itself. The relentless, rhythmic thumping of thousands of drums made of hippopotamus hide, a sound that vibrated through the stone floors of the city and into the marrow of the defenders' bones. They didn't attack immediately. They began to build. They dug trenches, erected giant catapults, and positioned their archers in a perfect, suffocating circle. Inside the walls, the situation was a different kind of war. Valencia was a city of ghosts and hidden daggers. Rodrigo had 4,000 soldiers to control a civilian population of over 15,000, many of whom were praying for the Almoravids to breach the walls. Every dark alley was a potential ambush. On the second night, a fire broke out in the grain district, a clear act of sabotage meant to starve the army before the first arrow was even fired. Rodrigo raced to the scene, his black cloak billowing behind him like the wings of a predatory bird. He didn't call for water, he called for executioners. He found the saboteurs near the granary, 3 local loyalists holding torches. The skirmish was brief and brutal. Rodrigo didn't use his sword. He used his heavy gauntlets, breaking the jaw of the leader and throwing the others into the very flames they had ignited. "This city is mine," he roared to the shadows, "and anyone who tries to burn it, burns with it." By the third day, the Almoravid siege engines were ready. The first massive stone boulders began to rain down on the city, crashing through tiled roofs and smashing into the narrow streets. The air was filled with the screams of the injured and the constant, terrifying whistle of incoming projectiles. Rodrigo spent his time on the battlements, moving from tower to tower, his presence acting as a shield for his men's crumbling morale. He saw a group of his mercenaries preparing to desert, huddled near a small postern gate on the eastern wall. He didn't approach them with a speech about God or country. He walked into their circle, pulled Tizona an inch from its scabbard, and looked the leader in the eye. "The Moors will give you a slow death," he whispered, his voice cold as a mountain stream. "I will give you a quick one. Choose." The men returned to their posts, trembling. The pressure reached a breaking point when the Almoravids attempted a night assault using massive wooden scaling ladders covered in raw hides to prevent them from burning. It was a moonless night, the only light coming from the glowing embers of the city's fires. The first the defenders knew of the attack was the sound of iron hooks clattering against the stone merlons. Rodrigo was in the central plaza, snatching a few minutes of sleep on the bare ground when the alarm bells began to toll. He didn't wait for his horse. He ran toward the northern wall, his armor clanking in the dark. The battle on the ramparts was a frantic, hand-to-hand struggle in the dark. The Almoravids were coming up the ladders in waves, their white robes stained with the soot of the siege. Rodrigo met them at the top of the wall. He swung his sword in wide, devastating arcs, clearing a path of severed limbs and shattered shields. He kicked a ladder away, watching as a dozen men tumbled into the dark moat below, but 2 more took its place. The sheer weight of numbers was beginning to tell. His men were being pushed back into the inner courtyards. In the chaos, an Almoravid captain, a giant of a man draped in leopard skins, lunged at Rodrigo with a heavy mace. The blow caught Rodrigo on the shoulder, denting his pauldron and sending a jolt of agony down his arm. Rodrigo didn't stumble. He stepped into the man's guard and drove a dagger through the slit in his helmet. The turning point of the night came when Rodrigo ordered the use of the Fire of the East. He had discovered jars of a volatile, naphtha-based liquid in the city's secret armory. He didn't waste it on the ladders. He ordered his men to throw the jars into the dry scrub and tents of the Almoravid vanguard right at the base of the wall. When the fire hit, it created a wall of flame 20 feet high, silhouetting the attackers and trapping them between the fire and the stone. The Christian archers, finally able to see their targets, unleashed a hail of arrows that turned the retreat into a massacre. As the sun began to bleed over the Mediterranean, the assault ended. The ground below the walls was a carpet of white robes and broken wood. Rodrigo stood on the blood-slicked battlements, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His shoulder was screaming in pain, and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. He looked out at the Almoravid camp. They weren't retreating. They were simply bringing up more engines, more men, and more drums. The circle was tightening. He realized then that he couldn't just defend. He had to break their spirit, or he would die as a king of a graveyard. He turned to his captains, his face a mask of iron. "Prepare the horses," he commanded. "Tonight, we don't wait for them. Tonight, we hunt." He looked at the black banners in the distance, knowing that the next move would either make him a legend or a corpse. The drums began again, a low, ominous vibration that shook the very air he breathed. Rodrigo reached down and picked up a discarded Almoravid spear, snapping it over his knee with a grunt of defiance. The city was silent, the only sound the crackling of the dying fires and the distant rhythmic pounding of the enemy. He knew the internal walls were holding, but the hearts of his men were brittle. He needed a miracle, or he needed to become one. The part ends with Rodrigo staring directly into the rising sun, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the captured city, while the sound of 1,000 Almoravid horns began to signal the next wave of the nightmare. The air inside Valencia had turned into a poison of sulfur and despair. For 10 days, the Almoravid drums had not ceased for a single minute, a psychological grinding stone designed to break the sanity of the defenders. Rodrigo looked at his knights. Their eyes were hollow, their skin gray from the lack of rations and the constant vibration of the enemy's war machines. The Almoravid commander, Sir Ibn Abi Bakr, had moved his personal pavilion to the center of the field of Quart, a vast flat expanse just beyond the city gates. He was so confident in the sheer mass of his 50,000 warriors that he hadn't even fortified his own camp. He believed the Cid was a trapped rat, waiting for the inevitable moment when the walls would crumble. Rodrigo, however, was never more dangerous than when he was cornered. He knew that a static defense was a slow suicide. He needed to strike the heart of the monster, or the monster would swallow the city whole. At the stroke of midnight, the Quarte Gate, which had been meticulously cleared of its rubble barricades in total silence, swung open on greased hinges. Rodrigo didn't lead a grand army. He led a lightning strike of 900 elite heavy cavalry, the Iron Company. Every horse's hooves were muffled with thick layers of burlap and leather. Every piece of armor was wrapped in dark cloth to prevent the glint of the moon from betraying their position. They moved like a phantom tide across the dry grass of the Huerta. Rodrigo rode at the apex of the wedge, Tizona resting unsheathed across his saddle. He could see the thousands of campfires of the Almoravid host, stretching out like a reflection of the stars. The arrogance of the enemy was their undoing. The sentries were focused on the walls, not the shadows creeping behind them. When they were 300 meters from the edge of the pavilion lines, Rodrigo raised his sword. The burlap was kicked free and the silence was shattered by a single, terrifying blast of a Spanish war horn. "Santiago y Tierra, España!" The cry erupted from 900 throats as the muffled trot accelerated into a thunderous gallop. The impact was not a clash, it was an explosion. The heavy Castilian chargers slammed into the sleeping Almoravid camp with the force of a falling mountain. Tents were flattened, their silk and linen becoming shrouds for the men inside. Rodrigo carved a path through the confusion, his sword moving with a rhythmic, lethal precision that severed limbs and tent poles alike. The Almoravids, caught in their tunics and without their shields, scrambled in the dark, often striking their own comrades in the blinding dust. The camp turned into a slaughterhouse of fire and screaming horses. Rodrigo's goal was not the rank-and-file soldiers. He was hunting the Black Pavilion of the Emir. He saw it, a massive structure of dyed wool surrounded by the elite Black Guard, a unit of fanatical warriors who had chained themselves together to ensure they could not retreat. As the Cid's wedge hit this human wall, the momentum slowed. The Black Guard fought with a terrifying suicidal intensity, using long pikes to disembowel the Christian horses. Rodrigo's horse, Babieca, reared as a spear grazed its flank, but the Cid held his seat. He leaped from the saddle into the middle of the chained guards, Tizona whistling through the air. Each strike of his blade shattered a link or a bone. He was a demon in polished steel, coated in the blood of his enemies until he was unrecognizable. The Emir, Sir Ibn Abi Bakr, emerged from his tent, clutching a curved scimitar, only to see his invincible guard being systematically dismantled by a man who seemed immune to death. The two leaders locked eyes across a pile of fallen warriors. The emir lunged, his blade a silver arc aimed at Rodrigo's neck. The Cid parried the blow with such force that the vibration numbed the emir's arm, then followed with a brutal pommel strike to the face. Before the emir could recover, Rodrigo's knights overran the position, setting the pavilion ablaze. The sight of their leader's tent in flames was the final blow to the Almoravid morale. The rumor spread through the darkness like a wildfire. The Cid is a ghost. He cannot be killed. The discipline of the Sahara warriors collapsed into a panicked rout. Thousands of Almoravids fled toward the sea or into the deep marshes of the Albufera, drowning in their heavy mail or being cut down by the pursuing cavalry. Rodrigo did not let his men linger for loot. He knew the enemy's numbers were still superior, and once the sun rose, the panic would fade. He ordered the trumpets to sound the recall. As the first light of dawn touched the field of Quart, the 900 knights rode back toward the gates of Valencia, dragging captured banners and leading a string of high-blooded Arabian horses. The field behind them was littered with 15,000 bodies, a testament to the power of a perfectly executed surprise. The city walls were lined with citizens who had watched the fires from above, their silent prayers turning into a deafening roar of "Cid! Cid! Cid!" Rodrigo reached the safety of the gate and dismounted, his legs shaking from the adrenaline and the weight of his armor. He looked back at the field. The Almoravid army was broken, but not destroyed. They were regrouping on the distant hills, their drums starting a new, slower, more vengeful beat. He had won the battle, but he had started a blood feud with an entire continent. His shoulder wound from the previous night had reopened, and a dark stain was spreading across his surcoat. He wiped a smear of blood from his brow and looked at his captains. They were smiling, but Rodrigo's face remained a mask of grim stone. He knew that the gold he had just won was paid for in time, and time was the one thing he was running out of. As the heavy iron bars of the gate dropped back into place, the sound of the Almoravid horns began to wail from the hills, a long, mournful sound that promised a war without end. Rodrigo turned his back on the field, his shadow falling across the blood-stained plaza of his new kingdom, knowing that the real traitors weren't outside the walls, but waiting in the shadows of the palace he had just saved. By 1097, Valencia had become a city of gold and paranoia. The walls that Rodrigo had defended with such ferocity now felt like the perimeter of a gilded cage. The external threat of the Almoravids had shifted from a constant storm to a slow, suffocating fog, but inside, the air was poisonous. Rodrigo was no longer the wandering hero or the beloved liberator. He was the Iron Prince, a man who slept with a dagger under his pillow and whose ears were tuned to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. The city's wealth had grown, but so had its resentment. The local Moorish aristocracy, who controlled the silk and spice trades, viewed the Cid as a temporary infection, while the Christian knights he had brought from the north grew restless, their pockets full of loot, but their hearts weary of the endless vigil. 1097 was the year the whispers began to carry the weight of lead. The palace of the Almoravid governors, now Rodrigo's seat of power, was a labyrinth of marble and shadows. Every servant was a potential spy, and every meal was a gamble with death. Rodrigo's health was failing. The old wounds from a lifetime of combat had begun to fester in the humid sea air. He spent his nights pacing the mosaic floors, his heavy boots echoing like the ticking of a clock. The first sign of the coming internal collapse was the silence of the souks. The vibrant markets of Valencia, usually a riot of color and noise, began to go quiet. Traders from the south stopped arriving, and the local merchants began to hoard grain and oil. Rodrigo's network of informants, a shadowy group of loyalists known as the Eyes of the Cid, reported secret meetings in the cellars of the wealthy. The conspiracy was not a single entity. It was a hydra of disgruntled nobles and Almoravid agents who had slipped over the walls disguised as beggars. The tension broke on a Tuesday in mid-August, during the weeks of fire, when the heat was so intense that the stone walls of the city felt hot to the touch. A shipment of luxury fabrics arrived from the south, purportedly a gift for Rodrigo's wife, Jimena. When the crates were opened in the palace courtyard, they did not contain silk. Out leaped 6 assassins, their bodies oiled to slip through a defender's grip, armed with poisoned needles and short, curved blades. The skirmish was a blur of frantic violence. Rodrigo, who had been inspecting the courtyard, was without his heavy armor. He dodged a thrust that would have pierced his heart, instead taking a jagged cut across his forearm. He grabbed a heavy bronze candle stand and used it as a club, crushing the skull of the nearest attacker while his personal guard, the sworn 12, finished the rest. The courtyard was left painted in blood, and Rodrigo stood in the center, his chest heaving, realizing that his own home was no longer a sanctuary. In response, Rodrigo unleashed a purge that would forever stain his legacy. He did not wait for formal trials. He knew that hesitation was the father of defeat. He ordered a total lockdown of the city. No one entered or left. For 3 days, the only sound in Valencia was the rhythmic pounding of boots as the Cid's knights conducted house-to-house searches. They found the hidden caches of weapons, the bags of gold coins minted in Africa, and the lists of names, men who had sworn to open the gates at the next Almoravid approach. Rodrigo sat in the judgment seat of the plaza, his face a mask of cold, unyielding granite. One by one, the conspirators were brought before him. Among them were men who had dined at his table. He didn't offer them the chance to speak. "You chose the shadow," he told them, his voice a dry rasp. "Now the shadow takes you." The executions were not quick. To ensure the message reached every corner of the city, Rodrigo ordered the trial of iron. The leaders of the revolt were forced to walk through the streets in chains before being executed on the battlements, their bodies left to hang as a warning to the Almoravid scouts watching from the hills. This was the moment the hero died and the tyrant was born. The city fell into a terrified silence, but the resentment only deepened, sinking into the marrow of the population. Rodrigo's isolation was now absolute. Even his most loyal captains looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear. He spent more time alone on the seaward wall, staring out at the Mediterranean, his hand constantly gripping the hilt of Tizona as if the sword was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world of the living. The psychological toll was compounded by a new threat from the north. King Alfonso, sensing the Cid's vulnerability, sent a demand for the royal fifth, a massive tax on Valencia's wealth that would have bankrupted the city's defenses. The envoy, a haughty count who had once mocked Rodrigo in the court of Castile, stood in the palace hall and spoke of the king's mercy. Rodrigo didn't even stand up. He looked at the count with eyes that had seen the destruction of empires. "Tell your king that I am the wall that stands between him and the desert," Rodrigo said, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling. "If he wants my gold, he can come and take it from my cold, dead fingers. But remind him that many have tried, and their bones are currently decorating my moat." The envoy fled, and Rodrigo knew he had just declared war on his own blood. As winter approached, the fever that had been lurking in the slums finally climbed the palace stairs. Rodrigo's strength evaporated. He became a ghost inhabiting his own armor. He would force his servants to strap him into his breastplate just so he could stand on the balcony for an hour, showing the city that the Cid still lived. But the rumors could not be suppressed. "The Cid is dying," the whispers went. "The Lion of Valencia is toothless." The Almoravids heard the whispers too. On the southern horizon, the dust clouds began to grow again, larger than ever before. This was not a raiding party. It was the Great Gathering, a force of 100,000 men led by the Almoravid emperor's own kin, moving north with the sole purpose of grinding Valencia into salt. Rodrigo lay on his bed, the fever burning through his veins like liquid fire. He could hear the distant, rhythmic thumping of the Almoravid drums beginning again, the same sound that had haunted him for years. He knew the end was coming, not just for him, but for his kingdom. He called for his wife and his priest, but he did not ask for prayers for his soul. He asked for his armor. He asked for his horse. Even in the grip of death, he was calculating the final move of the game. He realized that the only way to save Valencia was to perform one last act of defiance, a deception so great it would echo through the centuries. He looked at his trembling hands and then at Tizona, leaning against the wall. The part ends with Rodrigo staring at the flickering flame of a single candle in his chamber as the first horn of the Almoravid vanguard sounded from the hills, a long, mournful wail that signaled the beginning of the end. He closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in a final, desperate concentration. The year 1099 was the year time stopped for Valencia. Inside the palace, the air was heavy with the smell of myrrh and the metallic scent of a dying man's sweat. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar lay on a bed of silk and iron, his lungs rattling like a chest full of dry stones. The fever had finally conquered the man who had never lost a battle. Outside, the world was ending. The Almoravid host had arrived, a nightmare of 100,000 spears that stretched from the sea to the mountains, turning the horizon into a forest of black banners. The sound of their drums was no longer a rhythm. It was a physical weight that shook the glass in the windows and the hearts in the defenders' chests. They knew the Cid was dying. Their spies had confirmed it. They were waiting for the first sign of morning to launch an assault that would leave no stone standing upon another. In his final hour, Rodrigo called his captains and his wife, Jimena, to his bedside. He could no longer lift his head, but his eyes still burned with the cold light of a predator. He didn't speak of heaven or the salvation of his soul. He spoke of the city. He knew that the moment his death was announced, the defense would crumble and the massacre would begin. "You will not bury me," he gasped, his voice a ghost of the thunder it once was. "You will not weep. When the sun rises, you will strap me to Babieca. You will place Tizona in my hand and bolt my armor to my body. I will lead the charge one last time." His captains looked at each other in horror, but no one dared to defy the last command of the man who had become a god of war. As the moon reached its zenith, the Cid breathed his last, his hand still twitching as if reaching for a sword. The preparations were conducted in a silence so deep it felt like the city itself had died. In the flickering light of torches, the Sworn 12 performed the most macabre ritual in military history. They took Rodrigo's body, already stiffening in the grip of death, and encased it in his finest suit of polished Milanese plate. To keep him upright, they used a system of wooden splints and iron rods, bolting his greaves to the stirrups and his gauntlets to the reins. His face, pale as marble, was hidden behind a closed visor. In his right hand, they wired the hilt of Tizona, the blade gleaming with a cold, hungry light. As the first gray streaks of dawn appeared, they led Babieca, the great white stallion that seemed to understand the gravity of its burden, to the front of the gates. The Almoravids were prepared for a siege, but they were not prepared for a miracle. As the sun broke over the Mediterranean, the Quarter Gate opened for the last time. A lone trumpeter sounded a blast that echoed off the mountains, and then the Christian cavalry emerged. At their head rode the Cid. His white surcoat, emblazoned with the green cross, billowed in the wind. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He sat perfectly still, a silent, silver titan, reflecting the morning sun with blinding intensity. Behind him, 4,000 knights, fueled by a mixture of religious fervor and pure terror, began to trot. The rumor flew through the Almoravid ranks like a plague. "He is risen! The infidel king has conquered death itself." The Almoravid vanguard, composed of elite desert warriors who feared nothing, began to waver. They had seen the Cid wounded. They had heard he was dead. Yet there he was, charging toward them with the silence of a mountain. Panic, infectious and absolute, took hold. When Babieca broke into a full gallop, the Cid's body swayed slightly, the wired sword Tizona bobbing as if he were choosing his next victim. To the Africans, it looked as if an avenging angel had been unleashed from the gates of hell. The formation of 100,000 men, a force that could have crushed the peninsula, began to buckle before they even touched the Christian steel. The psychological shock was so profound that thousands of warriors simply turned and ran, trampling their own comrades in a desperate bid to escape the dead king. The collision was a symphony of chaos. The Christian knights, seeing the terror of their enemies, fought with the strength of 10 men. They followed the silent figure of their leader into the very heart of the Almoravid camp. Rodrigo's body remained upright, a steady beacon of iron in the middle of the carnage. Everywhere he rode, the enemy vanished. Sir Ibn Abi Bakr, the Almoravid commander, watched from his hill as his invincible army disintegrated into a panicked rabble. He saw the Cid's horse trample his personal guard, and he saw the visor of the dead king turned toward him. The emir did not wait to test the legend. He turned his horse and fled toward the sea, followed by his entire command. The pursuit lasted for leagues. The beaches of Valencia were littered with the discarded shields and turbans of an empire in retreat. It was the greatest victory of Rodrigo's career, and he wasn't even alive to see it. The Christian army didn't stop until the last Almoravid had been driven into the marshes or the sea. Only then did the sworn 12 ride to the front and take the reins of Babieca. They led the horse and its silent rider to a high cliff overlooking the city they had saved. There, in the fading light of the afternoon, they unbolted the armor and lowered the body of the Cid into the earth. The legend was complete. Valencia remained independent for years, protected by the shadow of the man who had refused to stay dead. The story of the dead rider spread across Europe and Africa, a tale of a man whose will was so powerful it could command his own corpse to win one last war. As the sun set on the day of the final battle, the only sound left was the wind whistling through the empty battlements of the city and the distant, rhythmic pounding of the waves against the shore. The knights stood around the fresh grave, their swords lowered in a final salute to the only king who never needed a crown. The gates of Valencia were closed, the white horse was led away, and the world realized that while the man was gone, the Cid would never truly die.